Mobilizing for victory. So, World War II is going to change the lives of Americans. You have to keep in mind, millions of individuals are going to serve in the armed forces. Even more are going to go on to work in like defense factories. And we actually see civilian employees of the federal government quadruple during this time period. Even children get involved, like saving tinfoil and scrap metal and etc. College students might be recruited to work on like scientific espionage and such. And so we are going to see that as much as Americans had so many differences leading up to this point, this common purpose of waging war is actually going to soften some of those divisions when it came to region, class, and like national origin. First of all, you've got to mobilize for victory though. And so you've got your economy that needs to be mobilized effectively. This is where we're going to see an expansion of the federal government, and the president is going to authorize like reorganizing existing government departments to create whole new agencies. It's things like investing in new factories and setting up war supply contracts. Generally, in these war contracts, they're going to favor existing corporations that already have experience as well in large-scale production. The other thing they're going to do when it comes in terms of the economy is they're going to fight inflation with price controls, and they're going to have to fight rationing when it comes to certain items, from tires to coffee to later in the war, gasoline and like shoes and everything. We actually see horse-drawn carriages make a comeback for a short time because there's so much scarce gasoline. Now, this is going to slow price increases, and that means Americans have a little bit more money. And what are they going to do? They're going to invest it and buy war bonds. And that actually finances about half of the war spending. The federal budget is going to increase to be 11 times as large as it was in 1939. Like I said, this is really what's going to pull America out of the Great Depression, is all of this federal spending. And there's an element of everyone can kind of get behind federal spending for the military and things that are going to help the military win in war. We are going to see the debt is going to increase sixfold though during this time as well. When it comes to industry, we're seeing a lot of industries having to convert from like consumer goods to defense production. Factories are going to retool to make war equipment, and they're going to do this pretty quickly. Remember, there was an element here of the Japanese thought they were going to destroy enough to kind of keep America out of the war for longer. And they're going to be surprised at how fast America is going to militarize for war. They are making war equipment, planes, ships, and all of this mass production technology is really important for things like aircraft production. And this is a big deal because in like Germany, they're producing planes in like small batches, and in Japan, they're producing planes one at a time. So mass production means we have a lot more planes. We get war boom cities actually popping up across the nation, like San Diego and Mobile, because they have these factories that are working round the clock to make armaments, to make planes, etc., etc. In fact, these cities, you get housing scarcities because there's a hordes of workers moving into these cities. Output from the United States war industries is staggering. It's something like by 1944, the United States is producing 40% of the world's military production, and that's really important for winning the war. Labor would offer a no-strike pledge for the duration of the war as well, so no one can accuse them of undermining the war effort. This does limit labor's economic gains, but because there's such a revving up of more and more production, the overall per capita income of an individual generally doubled during this time. And then we have science and technology. All kinds of new scientific enterprises are coming forth with World War II. It could be anything from new drugs such as antibiotics and blood transfusion procedures to weapon systems like radar, sonar, dozens of other kinds of military technologies. We're seeing this pattern here of after the war, we're going to have post-war federal support for science because they realize how much science can help contribute to winning a war. Especially with things like development of radar and radio detection, that helped defeat the Germans and the Japanese and basically control air over Europe. And then the biggest technological development of this time, the atomic bomb. FDR is going to establish the Manhattan Project late in 1941, and by December of 1942, scientists are going to prove it's possible to create and control sustained nuclear reaction, and then they're going to move from that theory into practice by 1943. And so this is going to usher in the age of atomic energy. We're also seeing Americans affected at home when it comes to the establishment more and more so of the military. War is going to require more than a 30-fold expansion of United States Armed Forces. This is soldiers, sailors, Marines, etc. By 1945, we see 8.3 million men and women are on active duty in the Army and the Army Air Forces, and another 3.4 million are on active duty in the Navy and the Marine Corps. The United States is only exceeded by the Soviet Union when it comes to number of troops. This means that the United States Army is 4 times as large as it was during World War I. We are going to see by the end of World War II, 292,000 men will die in battle. We see another 100,000 would survive from prisoner of war camps, and about 671,000 would return to the United States wounded. Now, most of the people that are going to serve in the uniform and everything are actually serving in support jobs. This is going to be things like repairing airplanes, building runways, tracking supplies, and then sadly enough, things like counting coffins. When we look at specific groups that are going to serve, we have to talk about groups like Native Americans. 25,000 Native Americans are going to serve in the armed forces, and generally they actually served in racially integrated units. One of the biggest things the Native Americans did during World War II that was really cool is that they would use the Navajo language as code, because it was actually one of the few tribes that had not been studied by German anthropologists. And you have to think about language development is going to be completely different for a Native American language versus like English, which is a mixture of Romance and Germanic languages and everything like that, that has roots that obviously Europeans are going to be able to break. When it comes to African Americans, you get about 1 million serving in the armed forces during World War II. The Army is going to organize Black soldiers into segregated units though. And a lot of times they tried to assign African Americans the most like menial jobs like construction work. They tried to exclude them from combat, but then you get manpower shortages would force a change in policy. African Americans are going to face discrimination on and off base. A really poignant and famous example of this was you have German prisoners of war in America, and actually one of the biggest ones was here in Texas. And you would see like German prisoners of war being allowed to watch movies from the front row along with like white GIs, but African American soldiers still had to be segregated and were forced to watch from the back. Still, we do see African American soldiers gaining distinguished records, and this is helping invigorate post-war efforts to achieve equal rights. We're also going to see women serve, although the nation had a much more mixed reaction to women who joined like the armed forces or the Army or Navy or as nurses, etc. They might join the WACS, which is the Women Army Corps, which is WACS, the WAVES, which is the Navy, the SPARS, which is Coast Guard, and then I'm going to get into the WASPs in a second. Basically, though, America, even though women are joining these groups, America really tried not to change the established gender roles, Military officials wanted women in uniform, though, to serve because that would free up men for combat, because women would serve in non-combat roles. So women are going to work switchboards, typewriters, inventory supplies. They might be photographers, code analysts, weather forecasters, radio operators, nurses. But one of the big departures from what was seen as acceptable women's work is actually 1,074 members of the WASPs, which is the Women's Air Force Service Pilots. This was basically a civilian auxiliary of the armed forces, the air forces, I should say. Basically, a lot of these women had learned to fly as private civilians, and they're going to serve in the Air Force by doing things like ferrying military aircraft across the country. So keep in mind, like, you're making a bunch of planes in Mobile, you got to get them to the aircraft carriers. So the women were the ones flying them. They also might tow targets for like anti-aircraft practice, test new planes, test new radar systems. But of course, there always had to be limits to what they could do. So for instance, the WASPs were not allowed to carry male passengers on their plane. We are going to see this group is dissolved, though, when supply of male pilots basically catches up with the demand.